A lot of people think, well, part of the justification for NASA is how are you going to get people who just engage, who fund this expensive, open-ended research into space if it's not government funded?
It's these really, really brilliant people in the sciences and astronomy who just have no idea what it is to also think about the economics of it. And that's always going to be absent from government, even academic institutions. This is absent from. What you need is the engineers and the scientists sort of telling the industrialists what's technologically possible, the industrialists telling the scientists what's economically possible, and each informing the other in a kind of joint decision. Like now that it's legal to do that, that is the main reason I think that the private space industry is progressing so rapidly. It's been 55 years since Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. In 1969, no one would have thought that the last man to set foot on the moon would do so a mere 3 years later. They saw a future of lunar colonies and space stations. The first man to step on Mars, they thought, was probably a young boy who watched Armstrong's first steps alongside his parents. And NASA was working to make these expectations a reality. Werner von Braun, the chief architect of the Saturn V rocket, had worked out a plan to bring man to Mars by the 1980s. None of these plans materialized. But now, a quarter of the way through this century, last century's projections of the future seem possible again. And not only possible, but possibly right around the corner. Today, on New Ideal, we're discussing space commercialization and its philosophical implications. I'm Mike Mazza, Associate Fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute. Joining me to discuss this is Tristan de Liège, Visiting Fellow also at ARI. Hi, Tristan.
Hey, Mike. Yeah, and part of the reason we wanted to do this podcast, and because not just because of the historical overview that you just briefly talked about, and that we'll get more into of the recent development in private space entrepreneurship, but also because of some of the things that Rand says about the space race that obviously she lived through, and some of her comments about Apollo 11 and her overall view of NASA and government's involvement in space, I think raised some interesting questions about how we should think about it philosophically. She certainly thought that the exploration of space during her time had enormous philosophical significance, but there are obviously lots of things that are coming up now with the development of private space entrepreneurship that raise important philosophical questions. And we think that objectivism has unique and valuable perspectives on those developments. So, Mike, maybe you can give us an overview of kind of how we got to this point, because I think the history is pretty interesting. And I think people don't actually know a lot about why private space exploration wasn't occurring earlier.
Yes, so private involvement in the space industry goes back pretty much almost all the way to its beginning. So um, Boeing and Lockheed Martin were involved in designing different aspects uh, of the technology for the Apollo programs. There have been since the '60s private satellites, telecommunication satellites, and then more recently in the '90s, in the '80s and '90s there were private companies designing and launching full-on rockets, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, exclusively in the United States. So there's been private involvement in the even in the government space industry as as contractors designing different parts, and then becoming more involved as time went on. But the private space industry as we know it today is pretty young. You could say 15, 20 years, depending on how you want to count. Both Blue Origin and SpaceX, who are the two most well-known and leading companies, were founded in the early thousands. What part of what made that possible is that until the mid 80s, private space commercialization and space launches were illegal. So the 1984 Commercialization of Space Act was the first step in legalizing private space exploitation. And even though that act was in the 80s, it took quite a while for it to become not just legal as a matter of law, but as a matter of fact. So various government agencies in the 80s and then in the 90s were given the power to regulate and control the private space industry, to license and permit private space flight. Even though it was legal as a matter of law, it wasn't until the 2000s that it really became legal in fact. So there were a few acts in the 90s: the 1990 Space Launch Purchase Act, the 1989 Commercial Space Act to implement the Space Launch Act. But it wasn't really until 2004 with the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act, which is an amendment to the original 1984 Commercialization Act, that Congress essentially ordered NASA to allow private spaceflight. So NASA and some other government agencies were in charge of permitting private space flight, and they really only allowed Boeing and Lockheed Martin, and then ULA, which is a kind of conglomeration of the two, to launch private rockets until 2004. And then it's really that 2004 Amendments Act that creates a legal framework for private space launches. It introduces what's called the learning period, where the FAA can't. There's a period of time where the FAA can't block private manned space flights, so that companies can learn how to do that. Until this act, the early acts made little difference to the possibility of a private space industry, because NASA effectively exercised its authority over private space flight to prevent it. It had a monopoly through the space shuttle program in the 80s and 90s, and it was only in the 90s that Boeing and Lockheed Martin were allowed to start launches, and then it's only in the thousands when it's sort of open season. Now, even after that, it took a lawsuit by SpaceX against the government to allow companies besides ULA, Boeing and Lockheed Martin, to compete for military contracts. So military contracts are an important revenue stream for private rocket companies, and the burden to prove security clearance and whatnot was so high that SpaceX argued was effectively creating a monopoly on private military contracts, and they won. And a lot of the private space industry now does military, bids for military contracts, and that's an important and legitimate revenue stream. The latest, I think, and most recent and most important point on this trajectory is the 2015 Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act, sometimes called the Space Act, which sort of begins the process of solidifying property rights to the exploits of space exploration. Allied with that is the Artemis Accords, which is an international agreement about concerning best practices and standards in space and recognition of different property rights. It's a non-binding international agreement, but it's a step in the right direction. And most recently, as in the last couple of days, we've seen that it's as good as it is today for private space companies. It could still be a lot better. The trouble SpaceX is having getting its Starship launch number 5 approved. There's environmental regulatory interference that it's hard to know the details. It looks like there's going to be some lawsuits around this, but it doesn't look like a sound government action. There's the FAA has been very slow to approve SpaceX's plans to launch 25 Starships a year as opposed to the current 5. And Elon Musk amusingly said that it shouldn't take longer to get the paperwork for a Starship launch approved than it should to design and launch a Starship. So there's still room for improvement, but the trend has been in a good direction for the private space industry. So the general point is just to make that it's been illegal for decades. And even though in the 80s, which is now 40 years ago, the steps to legalize it were beginning, it was legal but not permitted. So and now finally there's not been clear legal frameworks. There's been effective monopolies, and all of that is clearing up. So I think the future looks bright. But that's part of what it took to get us to today, to the private space commercialization that we're all watching with kind of excitement to see what these companies will do next.
Yeah, and I think you gave a really helpful overview of some of the recent legislation developments, and I think just if we're thinking in terms of political philosophy and some of the things that Rand has written about, and also Brandon and Alan Greenspan, if we're thinking about some of the essays from Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, which we recommend reading about monopolies, I think it's a lot of people don't fully realize. I think that NASA, as you said, like had effectively a legal monopoly. Um, well, they did have a legal monopoly until 1984, and then continued to de facto have that for some time afterward. And uh, I think part of what's important to dispel in terms of the myths around private spaceflight is I think there are a lot of people that think, you know, some of the things that NASA was doing, going to the moon, sending manned space flight missions with the space shuttle, launching satellites, and so on, just wouldn't have happened without private space flight. But we don't, and we'll talk about. Rand did make a comment about that we'll talk about in a moment. But part of what's important here is, and maybe we can actually transition to that right now, is that I think part of what's difficult about evaluating that is we just don't actually know, because private spaceflight was essentially illegal. And I think a lot of people have um, some sense of, or some version of the belief that private space flight was just not able to compete with NASA, or that there wasn't enough motivation from private industry. But that's actually not true. If you look at the developments, such as what you were just talking about, and how much has happened in such a relatively short period. But so maybe we can, now that I've already kind of brought up some of
Interject for
things about the space race, maybe we can kind of talk more about that and talk about Rand's view about it. Did you want to say one more thing, Mike?
Yeah. So I mean, it's an important point that it's you can, from a certain perspective, it's true. Like there was no motivation to do it from private industry, but there was no motivation because, I mean, imagine what you'd have to go through to actually get to the point where you could have some kind of product and bring it to market, and then at any point you have to have your main competitor NASA's approval to compete with it. So so there's both a kind of conflict of interest just in terms of competing for customers. But there's also, I think, if you look at the commentary on the early days of the private space industry from people at NASA and in academia too, there's a kind of ideological hostility to it too, like profiting from space is dirty or something, or it just won't work because reasons, only the government can raise enough money to have a space program, which is part of the reason they can only the government can muster those resources is it's artificially expensive because they have a monopoly in the first place. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons why this didn't happen. Chief amongst them is the in fact illegality of it.
Right, and just to add one more thing to that, Mike, I think from the other side, you might ask, well, why did NASA, because NASA was effectively had the authority to regulate uh, private space entry. Um, legally speaking, it was allowed after 1984, but they continue to make it difficult. And you might ask, like, well, why wouldn't NASA want that? And I think that also goes to the same problem of motivation, of government monopolies. Is they're not in it for profit. They're not in it for efficiency. That's not like what's driving them. That's not, they don't have shareholders to answer to, right? So their motivations are different than private companies, and they don't really have an interest in like allowing private spaceflight to begin unless they're ordered to do so, which is effectively what had to happen. But so if we're just Rand's view of the space race, I think what uh, many people might find surprising if they haven't read about it is that obviously, despite the fact that the lunar landing and the Apollo 11 mission as a whole was like NASA's sort of greatest achievement, the achievement of a government program, she was very clear that it was an enormous philosophical achievement. And I think it's worth reading from. I'm going to read a little bit from the Apollo 11 essay, uh, that which is a great essay also, and we highly recommend it, just to kind of clarify and underline how much importance she thinks it has. So Rand writes, quote, "The fundamental significance of Apollo 11's triumph is not political, it is philosophical, specifically moral epistemological. The lunar landing as such was not a milestone of science, but of technology. Technology is an applied science, i.e., it translates the discoveries of theoretical science into practical application to man's life. As such, technology is not the first step in the development of a given body of knowledge, but the last. It is not the most difficult step, but is the ultimate step, the implicit purpose of man's quest for knowledge. The lunar landing was not the greatest achievement of science, but its greatest visible result. The greatest achievements of science are invisible. They take place in man's mind. They occur in the form of a connection integrating a broad range of phenomena. The astronaut of an earlier mission who remarked that his spacecraft was driven by Sir Isaac Newton understood this issue. In this sense, the lunar landing was a first step, a beginning. In regard to the moon, but it was a last step, an end product in regard to the Earth, the end product of a long intellectual scientific development." Um, And then she says, "This does not diminish in any way the intellectual stature, power, or achievement of the technologists and the astronauts. It merely indicates that they were worthy recipients of an illustrious heritage who made full use of it by the exercise of their own individual ability." So it's, you know, it's an absolute unqualified admiration, really, from start to finish of the achievement. And she does talk about the government involvement. She says that uh, when you have a mixed economy, you have to evaluate things in a slightly different way. You have to evaluate which aspects of the achievement happened because of, or which aspects of the event happened because of force, and which aspects were an achievement and happened as the result of freedom, as the result of individuals being able to act rationally, and of their own free choice. And her evaluation of the Apollo 11 mission is that uh, it mainly is showing us about human ability and showing us something about the power of human reason. And the fact that it's a government program doesn't really take away from that, because it's the coercion involved was not what made it successful. And it's not the thing that created it. And the people that joined the program were free. Uh, the scientists and the engineers and so on were people who chose to join it and were motivated by a love of knowledge and a love of space exploration and the desire to take part in it. So I think it's important to realize that it's not like just because it's a government program that she has a super negative view about it. Um,
Yeah.
Mike, do you want to say some? Yeah, what's your take on Rand's view of the space race from? Rand's perspective.
Well, so I mean, I agree with her evaluation of its philosophical significance, and I also, also I'm on the same page as far as the how to evaluate it in the context of a mixed economy. One thing I want to take issue with from that essay, though, is she makes this, and it's an aside. It's not a key point in the essay that she makes the comment that the NASA space exploration is economically premature. She says that the economy is not quite ready for private exploration of space. So in that sense, it's economically premature. And my reaction to that is I don't think that's quite right, and it's not. But it's not that it's quite wrong either. It's that given the fact that the private exploration and private launches and there's is still illegal. The only way to have access to space is through the government. We just don't know what kind of um, reaching into space the private industry would have attempted, at that level of technology and wealth. So my disagreement is just that no, it's not really that we are or aren't ready for it. It's just that we couldn't know at the time, and the time's passed, so we can't ever know the answer to that question. Another thing that, and this is something I think is worth emphasizing, that I agree with from that essay, and I think it's important, is that the success of that program is its own undoing. So I mentioned in the intro, there's this amazing achievement. Neil Armstrong sets foot on the moon in 1969, but then by 1972 we have the end of the program, and there's nothing really exciting after that. What comes, I guess there's Skylab, which barely anybody knows about who's not a space geek, and then there's the next thing is the space shuttle, which seems really cool, but actually the purpose of it was to lower the cost of cost per pound of access to space, but is actually more expensive per pound than the Apollo 11 program's price. So the question in a lot of people's minds is kind of like, what happened? Like, how could it have been so successful? And then that's the end of it. And she makes the point in that essay that that kind of government program has as its success is its own undoing. That is, well, why were we going to the moon to begin with? Well, the motivation of the people who are actually in charge of the thing and funding it is to beat the Soviet Union, which might be a completely valid, military rationale for it or something. But okay, you beat the Soviet Union there. The Soviet Union's been defeated and shown up. Okay, now what? I guess what's the next step? Like, there's no other thing to beat them at. If that's the only, now you need to come up with a new reason to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to what? Send more people to the moon and do exactly what? Some scientific research. Is that really worth the price? And is there enough motivation to do that? So that kind of program, just even as amazing as it was, and as inspiring and philosophically significant as it was, it's different than a profit seeking motivation in that the success of a profit seeking motivation leads to bigger and better of the same thing. You reinvest in your company, you take the next step, you expand. New players enter the market once they see one firm is successful at it. That's a kind of proof of concept, and now others join. So there's a self-perpetuating uh, pattern to private, or there would be a self-perpetuating pattern to private space exploration, but the government monument building or even military achievement has its kind of abortion procedure built in, that it's just okay. This now it's over. We did it. Now it's over. And now this next point kind of goes beyond what Rand's really talking about. There's the question of, was all of that worth it? Was the Apollo program worth it? And um, it's I think this is a kind of common view that yeah, it was worth it because, and the because is, well, one is we beat the Soviet Union, national pride, military reasons, the philosophical aesthetic uh, uh, perspective that Rand takes. Those are all reasons to think it was worth it. But if you ask kind of common people who are fans of the space program, say, yeah, look at all the technology we got out of it. This is a kind of common view that a lot of the amazing technology of the latter half of the 20th century came out of the space program. There's actually a TV show I like that kind of takes that premise and runs with it. It's called For All Mankind. It's an alternative history uh, uh, premise, and it's what if the space race continued? It didn't just end at the with the moon landing. It continued arbitrarily into the future. It's the current season is going to pick up in present day. Um, and one of the things you see in that show is there's all this great technology decades earlier. There's electric vehicles in the 80s, and there's computers earlier, and there's a fictional equivalent of SpaceX and Blue Origin in the 90s. And that's just not true. I think that the space program gave us all of this. It did give us technology that came out of it, but you have to take into account the seen and the unseen, the economist Bastia would put it. Says all of this money went into the space program, came out of the private economy, would have found some other place to be invested in, and it's not just the cash that's malinvested or otherwise invested. It's all of the best and the brightest people in science and engineering go into the program. And this is one of the things Rand points to in the essay, like how amazing an achievement of that is. But again, is this a net material technological positive? I think my view is that it's not. That all of that talent and money would have gone into something else. For all we know, we're 15 to 20 years behind in computer science than we would be had there not been that push into space. Other areas of the economy, we just can't know, and we won't know into the future. What we see now with the private space industry is what progress in space could look like when it's done freely.
Yeah, and I just one other thing about the space race in particular, it is worth noting that in that very essay, Rand does say that the idea of a competition between the Soviet Union and the United States is there's something morally repugnant about that, insofar as we there's not a common principle that binds us to or bound us at that time to Soviet Russia, as though we could be friendly competitors in the same way that athletes can compete, or that companies can compete in a free market, as if they're both providing values. One of them is a dictatorship and the other is a free country. So there's no, you don't need the space race to sort of assess which one is more capable or which one is more worthy of admiration or something like that. The whole idea of that is repugnant. But I think to your point, I think Rand would certainly leave open if there's a military um, advantage to making sure that you have better control of space than your enemies. That's obviously a valid function of government. And so maybe we can go a little bit deeper into some of the advantages of private space exploration then, now that we've kind of talked about the history of it. So one of the things that Rand talks a lot about in different essays is the idea of uh, pull peddling. And maybe you want to say a bit about that, Mike. So I know you already brought up the issue of the lawsuits that SpaceX and Blue Origin had to bring against the FAA. So do you
Um,
want to talk about?
it was SpaceX, and it wasn't against the FAA. It was a lawsuit to uh, change or make more accessible the requirements to launch military equipment into space. So, like military satellites, for example, you can't just have any old people, there's sensitive material, national security interests at stake. So there does need to be some like qualifications that your company can adhere to the standards of secrecy. The problem was that they were so arbitrarily burdensome that only the kind of old guard players, Boeing and Lockheed Martin, could possibly meet them. And the argument was that they need to um, make it more objective so that new entrants could come in and bid for these contracts. And then once they did, SpaceX cleaned their clock. Right, they got all the contracts. They were able to make the best rockets. So they outcompeted everyone. Um, but to the point of pull peddling, I mean, one of the things that we have to be, or at least the space startups have to be mindful of, is what makes what they're doing possible is that their rights are being respected finally. They're being allowed to, or their right to exploit space is starting to be recognized, starting to be codified into law. They need to be careful that they don't start to use the state apparatus to destroy their competition. So there have been lawsuits back and forth between Blue X and Space Origin, and excuse me, uh, Blue Origin and SpaceX, in particular, alleging unfair uh, unfair NASA contracts. So one of the allegations is that SpaceX won these moonlander contracts from NASA, and then people who were on the committee that approved this wound up working at SpaceX. So some kind of conflict of interest. There's lawsuits from Blue Origin against SpaceX about uh, uh, how many launch pads in Florida they get access to, and Blue Origin is saying, well, they're launching so much that closes the opportunity for their competitors. And I mean, the solution to that one is that that property is sold off to private competitors, on the private market, and they can outbid each other for access to those launch facilities. Right now, they're owned and operated by, I think it's by NASA property. Um, so that's a point of caution, that they don't get involved in this seeking of special privileges. Now, the fact that a good chunk of revenue for these companies is coming through the NASA moon program is just going to be inherently distorting. That NASA shouldn't be doing that. There's, at least for now, there's no military necessity of being on the moon. These private space companies, if they want to go to the moon, they can get venture capitalists to invest, not taxpayer dollars. Um, but that's more of a point of caution. I think one thing we wanted to talk about also was just, and this kind of piggybacks off what we were saying earlier about the government programs being their own undoing, about the sense of achievement we can have from the private space industry. So there's this kind of, I think of it as a smear. They're calling the commercialization of space the billionaire space race. And if you just think for a minute about what would an achievement or just bragging rights be for Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, who runs Blue Origin, or Jared Isaacman, who was just in the news for his Polaris Dawn mission that paid SpaceX to do the first private spacewalk. He's a billionaire also. Virgin Galactic has a space program also. It's another one who's smeared as billionaire space race. But just what would be an achievement for them? Well, an achievement for somebody like Jeff Bezos is not to go to the moon and just show off and shut everything down. It's to build a profitable company like Amazon. And that means that achievement is just that self-perpetuating cycle of bigger and better things, driving down costs, pushing the boundaries of technology, and eventually, once human beings start going out farther and farther, I mean, if that turns out to be profitable, they'll be pushing boundaries of what their bodies can withstand in the environment of space. That's a whole lot different than beating the Soviet Union, which, as legitimate of a goal that might be, again, the achievement and the success criteria for Musk or Bezos or Isaacman is to do some to achieve some engineering profitable engineering or scientific feat or just commercial feat. Putting a factory in orbit is one of the goals of Blue Origin. So so it's just a whole the possibilities and what the future will look like is just so radically different than if we just think of it as the government space program. It's, well, we walked on the moon. Okay, that's over with. Now what are we going to do? Well, we could
Yeah.
walk on Mars and maybe people could stay on Mars for a little while and then come back. And but it's no, if it's an achievement of the private industry, it's got to be we go to the moon and we make money, and now we do even more things on the moon and make more money.
Right, and that's to say nothing. I think just to give some sense of the scale of innovation that's happening, because I think a lot of people don't know about the all the different ways that innovation is happening, and that's something that is also only possible when you have a private space industry where, as you said, like people are motivated by reducing costs because that's part of the whole point of what they're doing. For example, cost-effective small satellites that is an emerging market that's growing enormously, and that enables satellites to be more maneuverable um, and improve like cellular networks and things like that. Um, Reusable rockets. So I know, Mike, you're working on an article that talks about the importance of that. Just reducing costs in general in terms of transportation and movement. So reducing costs through uh, debris removal to reduce damage, through more efficient propulsion. So there are all these different uh, avenues of innovation that are happening now because of private innovation in space entrepreneurship. And to your point, Mike, I think it's not a coincidence that NASA sort of floundered after, um, to a large extent, after the lunar landing, which was arguably its greatest achievement. Obviously, they did have other things like the space shuttle, but I think that the nature of a government program is such that the motivations are really based around the wrong kinds of activities. They're based around goals that don't necessarily lead to an open-ended sort of problem solving that you find with someone who's like motivated by and needs to answer to like reducing costs and like solving specific problems. The NASA's motivation, I mean, the space race itself was essentially something that John F. Kennedy wanted and that was supported by presidents after that. But it's to your point, it's like, where do you go after that? It's like you get an order from the government or from the president essentially saying, oh, we want to do this thing. And yeah, it's an amazing achievement to do it. But then it's like, now what? Whereas with, to use the examples of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, they actually have a vision of what they're trying to achieve. They want, they want humans to be able to mine resources on asteroids. They want to see if they can get people to live in space and be able to do that without their bodies degrading and so on. People colonize space, and there's a whole vision for the possibilities that humans can achieve, and they want to achieve those things step by step as far as they can, and it's a completely different motivation.
Yeah,
um One other thing I know that we hear a lot about as an objection is,
but Tristan,
a lot of times
just
people argue. Oh yeah,
on
go
that last,
ahead. Yeah.
yeah. So just on that last point, I mean, one of the things that's exciting about this is there's a kind of, uh, I mean, I have the hope and maybe even the expectation that these companies will be able to succeed. But that's by no means a foregone conclusion. So they might, it's their own resources they're putting at risk, or the resources of their investors that they've been entrusted with. And it might turn out that um, the way to make space profitable is not to send humans, it's to send robotic mining rigs to asteroids rather than human roughnecks. Maybe there really is no economic reason to have a base on Mars, and part of but Mars or the Moon. Part of what we're going to do, or that these companies are going to do, is run the experiments to find out whether or not that's true. And so back to the point earlier you said about what one of the things they're innovating on is reusability. There's an interesting recent interview with Jeff Bezos, where he talks about the economics of reusable rockets, and he says one of the things that the market has proven is that single stage and first stage, single stage rockets are way more cost effective when they're reusable, and that multi stage rockets, they're way more cost effective if the first stage is reusable. But whether or not the second stage also needs to be reusable to, save maximally save costs is still an open question, at least to the people at Blue Origin. And he says the way to figure that out is to actually do it. You can do the calculations on paper and do your pros and cons, but until they actually get things into production, they're not going to have a real clear answer. What is it more cost effective to have a reusable first stage and then later stages are disposable, or some combination? Um, and you're never going to answer those kind of questions unless you have to answer to, is this profitable? That is, are we getting more out of the resources we're putting in than we would with alternative uses? And one more striking thing from how Bezos talks about what he's doing at Blue Origin is, in this earlier in the same interview, he says to the interviewer that if you think about it, space flight is a solved problem and has been since the 60s. We know how to get rockets into space. We know how to get to the moon. What we really need to innovate on is manufacturing and cost reduction. And that motivation is, you can say that's your motivation as NASA, but it's really not there. Like you said, like, well, some presidents and elected officials like these programs, but then what if they don't? I mean, if you're a company and the CEO, it's a profitable company, and the CEO and a lot of the shareholders just get bored of it, well, there'll be somebody who wants to pick it up because it's a profitable thing. Somebody will buy it. Somebody will invest new resources. You'll hire a new CEO. If it's a state project and the elected officials or the mood of the public changes, why continue with it? This is exactly what happens with NASA and the pad. There was no will to go to Mars, so it didn't happen because there's no real reason anymore. So that's really what's exciting to me, is that if you think about the private industry as a giant experiment to see what humanity is currently technologically and economically capable of doing in space, then that's what's most exciting. And it might be disappointing in a certain respect. Okay, going to Mars is a giant boondoggle, but maybe orbital zero gravity manufacturing is super profitable, and maybe we'll get super cheap rare materials and have all kind of new technology because of robotic mining of asteroids or something. Maybe that's what it'll be. Everybody hopes it looks like Star Trek, but that might not turn out to be in the near future.
Yeah, and so one thing that you might raise as an objection or a counter to some of the things you said, Mike, and I do hear this a lot, is that there's a suspicion or a skepticism that um, private companies would engage in scientific research, and in this context, in research into space. And so a lot of people think, well, part of the justification for NASA is, how are you going to get people who just engage, who fund this expensive, open-ended research into space, if it's not government funded? Like, would that actually take place?
Mm. Yeah, that's a kind of common worry people have, and there's a related worry that I know it best from this commentator Neil deGrasse Tyson, that if you think about it, okay, there are commercial options in space, but just like exploration, like the a private company would never do that. It's too expensive, and like you need a state sponsor to do that. And my reaction to that is all of this kind of objection is just fundamentally silly if you think about it for a little bit. So the cost per pound for the space shuttle to like how much does it cost to get something in orbit for the space shuttle? It's like 25 grand per pound. Was I mean, it's hard to get these estimates that vary a little bit, but just as a kind of rough guesstimate, per pound, 25 grand. And the kind of current state of the art is the Falcon 9, which I think is like 2,500 per pound. And then the SpaceX's projections for the Starship is going to be like $2 million-ish per launch, and it can launch 200 tons to orbit. So if you just do the rough math, it's like a couple bucks per pound. Now that hasn't happened yet, so maybe it won't. But even the competitive competition, Blue Origin, they're thinking that their New Glenn is going to be 50, 100, maybe 200 to orbit per pound. So
Yeah, that's incredible.
exploration and scientific research will be way cheaper under a private space regime, private space companies. And then you say, okay, well, yeah, but it's expensive to send probes to other planets and put up giant telescopes. I mean, Harvard's endowment is $50 billion. Like they can, if they want to do astronomy, they can pay SpaceX to launch a satellite for them, or a probe, or some consortium of universities can chip in. As far as exploration, I mean, if you think of exploration as just an adventure, just to push boundaries, a lot of exploration has been in the past funded by private societies independently wealthy people. I mean, you're talking $10, $5 per pound. I mean, I could afford a ticket if to orbit if that's really what was the market cost of it, in 10 years. So what could a billionaire or even a millionaire afford in 20 years? So the whole that kind of way of thinking um, is part of what the problem was at NASA. It's these really, really brilliant people in the sciences and astronomy who just have no idea what it is to also think about the economics of it. And that's always going to be absent from government, even academic institutions. This is absent from. What you need is the engineers and the scientists sort of telling the industrialists what's technologically possible, the industrialists telling the scientists what's economically possible, and each informing the other in a kind of joint decision about where to invest research and development. And that is the main reason, like now that it's legal to do that, that is the main reason I think that the private space industry is progressing so rapidly. I mean, remember the first rocket to land vertically was 2015, and it was it was Blue Origin's New Shepard. A month later, the first Falcon rocket for SpaceX landed, and now it's like almost to the point where it's like, oh, another rocket lands. That's cool, but whatever. I mean, that was just in cartoons 11 years ago.
Yeah, and yeah, I think philosophically that sort of attitude I think does come the sort of elitist attitude. There's a philosophical error that I think is often behind that. That there's something I think you alluded to it a little bit earlier, that like the idea that there's something that pollutes science, or that degrades the possibility of like pure science, or the value of science, if you're considering economic factors and practicality and profitability and things like that. Um, but the objectivist perspective is it's just the opposite. It's It's not as though you have to justify every instance of theoretical science with like a practical import, but the point of theoretical science, as Rand makes clear in Apollo 11, is like practical achievement, right? And it's um, so the whole idea that like private companies don't care about doing research is also just absurd from the perspective of the fact that they're well aware of the impact that understanding physics and understanding astrophysics has on what they're trying to do and engineering and so on. And what's beautiful about what's happening is that now as you were saying, it's all integrated. It's all these people working together. It's not these sort of elitist scientists that are engaged in research projects that are totally disconnected from economic value, where taxpayers might be just bearing that cost just for the sake of the prestige of a certain president or other.
Mm.
Um, Maybe we can just transition now to just because we've already been talking about the progress that's happening so rapidly in private space exploration and entrepreneurship. Maybe we can just talk about how relevant it is to technological progress in general. So, just under the general heading of why is this so important? It's obviously like really exciting and really amazing, but maybe we can say a bit more concretely about why it's so relevant to technological progress in general. So, I don't know if you have thoughts on that, Mike.
Yeah, well, I mean, some of it speaks for itself, right? So if we can get access to rare earth minerals, from space and have an abundance of them, we wouldn't call them rare anymore. Um, and those are kind of important components to terrestrial technology, batteries, electric vehicles, cell phones, computers. Like, obviously, getting access to space resources has would have a major economic and technological uh, uh, um, uh, implications. But additionally, I think and if you take the more philosophical perspective of productivity as sort of expanding your ability to control nature and determine outcomes that are to your advantage. Like, space is a whole new realm of reality that if we can master, we can make our lives better off and mitigate risks. Uh, um, SpaceX has this sort of borderline fantastical view of making humanity multi-planetary. Just the ability to control the surround, the objects in space or whatever. You don't need to think about it as multi-planetary, but just could we mitigate some kind of collision between the Earth and a celestial body, or could we manufacture in space? There's certain products that might be easier to manufacture in a zero G environment. I've heard that pharmaceuticals might be either new things might be possible or existing possibilities might be much more economical manufacturing in a zero G environment. So it's just a whole new dimension of control that we could open up to ourselves. And I mean, Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin are explicitly thinking in this way. There's a good interview of Jeff Bezos from maybe a year ago on the Lex Frieden podcast, where he talks about what he thinks Blue Origin is doing is like laying the groundwork for what's going to be really exciting, which is that if Blue Origin and SpaceX can really drive down costs like radically, he's looking forward to 10, 20 years from now when there'll be dorm room space startups. It won't cost you won't need billions of dollars of venture capital to have a space company. You'll just need ordinary 7, 8 figures, still a lot of money, but much more attainable to smart young people at Stanford. That so you can have like the space equivalent of a space of a Facebook or a Google or something forming in somebody's dorm room or somebody's garage. So that's, I mean, that's its relevance for technological progress, just opening up that whole new realm of productive activity that is cut off from us right now.
Yeah, and so I mean another kind of related question, which I think is partly answered by that first question, is okay, so how does it make us better off? Um, like, does space exploration make us better off and like now, or does it make us better off at a certain point? I mean, obviously, some of the things that I we already talked about. So obviously, mining, you know, energy is one of the main costs, if not the main costs, of pretty much anything we do on Earth. Anything we build, anything we transport. Um, any like use of information or information sharing like takes energy and costs energy. So the more resources that we can get from, for example, asteroids, um, or potentially other celestial bodies, that's, you know, obviously potential reducing costs of everything on Earth.
So if you just if you ask this question and it's just like, yeah, I'm just curious, like how will it make how will this make my life better off or something? You say, yeah, okay, right now it's just cool to watch, but in 10 years, you know, you'll have a cheaper electric cars will cost half the money because we'll have access to more lithium or something. But a lot of times this question comes up as like a kind of objection, like it's just wasteful. Like, oh, it's just Elon Musk's vanity project and Jeff Bezos and his billions, and it's the billionaire space race, like I was saying before. But just if you imagine asking this question about like the internet in like 1995, like, oh, these billionaires have their little companies where they send messages back to each other, and it's who can, oh, I can send an email, that's kind of cool, but like how does this really make my life better off? It's just a kind of lack of vision in asking in posing the question. If you pose the question as like this is a gotcha or an objection, like this is just this frivolity that it's kind of cool but it's not actually good for anybody, why don't we just give all the money to the starving in Africa, or what, you know, UNICEF or something. um, it's like, yeah, right now it doesn't affect you, but when the internet was founded, it didn't affect the average person. And then look at all the wealth it's created since then. And it's the same. It's the pattern in every new technology and every new frontier. At first,
Yeah.
yeah, it's just you know, the daring explorers who are coming to the new world, or but then it's everybody, and then it's the middle class, and then it's the poor. Immigrants aren't people coming to the new world begin as like Columbus is sponsored by the Queen, and then it ends as it's poor people coming here for a better life. When in the, you know, the internet, at first it's the military and it's universities and it's very wealthy entities, and then eventually it's like, you know, you walk down the street and the homeless guy has a cell phone. Um, so so there's the concrete answer, and then there's the abstract answer. So, yeah, part of it is we can't envision it. I mean, if you could know exactly how to make money, a lot of money from space, you'd be doing it. So,
Yeah, and part of what's philosophically important here, to segue off of that, is it it's a sort of attitude shift. It's not about, so we can point to, you know, I think even what you said is maybe even underselling it, because there are already benefits that we're getting from, for example, developments in satellites and things like that. Um, but even setting that aside, yeah, so even the things that are unknown and that are speculative, there's a philosophical importance to recognizing and celebrating human progress and celebrating individuals who take those kinds of risks. And there are several uh, authors that I'd recommend. I think you would agree, Mike, that are really good on this point. I think one is Deirdre McCloskey. So she talks about, she has historical view of where people essentially made the progress of industrialization possible by celebrating and recognizing certain kinds of risk taking, certain kinds of work ethic, um, certain kinds of diligence. So, really, just like certain moral recognitions that made human progress possible. And then Jason Crawford is another philosopher who writes about this. He has a really amazing Substack about it, and he's been organizing conferences and about moral progress and recognizing it, and the uh, the connection between the moral recognition of progress and technological progress, and how, to your point, Mike, of some of the stuff we said earlier, like these are really bold uh, entrepreneurs who are taking personal risks, like, um, and it we kind of owe it to them to recognize it, but also just more than that, if it's not recognized and not celebrated, there's no like guarantee that people keep doing that. There's no guarantee that we will live in a political culture where that's still possible, and not just go back to what we had before with NASA, where it it just wasn't happening, and NASA was effectively blocking it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think one of the things that's so there's one segment of the culture is very excited about Blue Origin, SpaceX. Others we haven't mentioned that get less press, like Rocket Labs is doing cool things. Um, one of the things that, so what they're doing is exciting, but also the reception, at least by a certain segment of the culture, is very heartening to see, like kind of like fandom around this, and it is exciting. And unfortunately, on the other hand, there is a negative view of this, which is very, at least to me, demoralizing. And it's we have to work to make sure that the super fans have the day, and not the nihilists who want to tear this all down. Uh, I think on that note, we should wrap up. So during our discussion, we mentioned Ayn Rand's essay Apollo 11 that we recommend giving a read, and also Keith Lockich's essay on Ayn Rand's essay on Apollo 11 is a very worthwhile companion piece to take a look at. If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and click the bell to get notifications from when we go live or post new recordings. If you're watching the recording, please like, comment, share. That helps us attract new viewers, and it helps the algorithm promote us to interested viewers. Please consider doing the same if you're watching on Facebook or any other platform. If you have questions or comments about today's episode, or you have suggestions for future episodes, please send us an email at newideal@aynrand.org. We read all of your emails, we reply to many, and we often take suggestions for podcast topics. Thanks, Tristan.
Thanks, Mike.